Hello and welcome. I'm George Crump, lead analyst with Storage Switzerland. Thank you for joining us this morning. Today we're going to be talking about how to design a compliant and GDPR-ready collaboration system. So moving beyond the concept of file sync and share and really developing a collaboration system that is not only going to work for the enterprise and its users, but also help maintain all the various policies and things that are coming down the pike. Joining me in the conversation, I've invited kind of a frequent guest to our webinar platinum, Mr. John Toor, CMO of Cloudian. Hey, John, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, George. Good to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you. And then also joining us is Doug Soltesz. He is the Director of Product Solutions at SME. Doug, thanks for jumping on with us today.
Thanks for having me, George.
No problem at all. All right, guys. So, hey, before we get too far in, why don't we do some really quick background information on you guys and your companies. John, you want to give a quick 20 seconds or so on you and Cloudian?
Sure. So I'm John Toor, the CMO of Cloudian. Cloudian is a provider of enterprise storage solutions. We do on-prem object storage, so you can think of it as bringing a cloud-like storage solution into your data center behind your firewall where you're managing it, you're providing the security, and it scales seamlessly. So just like the cloud, you can grow the system on demand to meet your changing requirements.
And I'm Doug Soltesz.
And Doug? Good.
Sorry, I jumped the gun there.
No problem.
And so I'm Doug Soltesz. I'm the Director of Product at Storage Made Easy. At Storage Made Easy, we focus on a product called the Enterprise File Fabric. What that does is it works with leading types of storage like Cloudian to bring you compliance, governance, and solutions behind your firewall that you would associate with, say, 365, Google Drive, Dropbox, and whatnot. And so today we're going to be exploring how to help GDPR or other compliances with a Cloudian-backed solution.
Awesome. And then for those that don't know me, I'm George Crump, founder and lead analyst at Storage Switzerland. Been doing this for 12 years now. And prior to that, I was CTO at a large storage integrator designing storage solutions for all kinds of different data centers. So guys, let's kind of start by sort of level setting. And just kind of talk about sort of the evolution of collaboration. You know, I guess I'm actually thinking that I missed a bullet. There was one point, if you remember the term sneaker net, where you would hand a floppy disk to a partner to take a look at. But that really dates me. So as network attached storage systems and file servers, and then and really I have emailing attachments in there, but emailing is still, Doug, it seems to be still like one of the biggest quote-unquote collaboration methods around. Is you send an attachment, and I mean, in my world, that's really dangerous because if we send out an attachment, it gets edited by 4 different people, and I get 4 different versions of a doc. But that's still a pretty common way that people try to distribute data, right?
It is, and as you said, it's got a couple of drawbacks, right? So you don't know what the latest version is. It's not necessarily in the shared storage where anybody can find it. And then I think most of all is that email's got some limitations on file sizes. And PowerPoints like the one we're showing today, they keep growing in size with better images, graphics, and whatnot. So I think that we're seeing email's limitations is the reason why we're pushing to some of these more advanced types of collaboration.
Yeah, and then and I think, John, early on, in sort of an attempt to manage that was sort of the concept of SharePoint. And I guess I've seen a few organizations sort of implement it well, but it doesn't seem like it sticks for a long period of time. It's almost like it's overly complicated. What do you see there?
Yeah, I mean, people definitely will gravitate towards ease of use every time, right? Users want the solution that is the most convenient, the most painless, the most easily adopted by everybody. Because obviously if you're doing collaboration, it only works if it's adopted by everybody. And if you have something which only gets adopted by a subset, that by default is no longer a collaboration tool. So the cloud services have really got ease of use down pat, and I think that's where this whole topic today comes in: is how do we replicate that kind of ease of use so people actually will use it and therefore achieve the level of collaboration we want without having to adopt to things like sending things around on emails or putting them out in the public.
Yeah. And sort of tying into that, we saw the advent of, and I think this is kind of where we are today, right, is this concept of a consumer-grade, cloud-only file sync and share, Dropbox, I used to say, spread quicker than a virus, but that means it was bad, and I don't want to kind of classify it in there with a virus. But man, the proliferation of things like Dropbox in particular and other tools, Doug, early on was, you talk about hitting a market need really, really fast. I mean, that was really well done on the part of some of those applications. But I think as part of that, as an organization, you started to really lose control of your data. And we saw this establishment of sort of this enterprise approach to file sync and share. And I think what we've seen, though, is it's kind of like a stalling of that, right? That, it really became hard. And so if we kind of look at the state of collaboration, what we see is that most organizations have moved or are trying to move from pure consumer file sync and share to more secure products. Doug, you talk with a lot of customers. Where do you think we are in that transition? Some days I feel like, I'm just kind of talking to the wind and everybody's still letting their users use Dropbox, and then other days it feels like, okay, maybe we're making some progress and people are heading down that path. What do you tend to see?
I think it depends on the size of the organization. So clearly smaller organizations are able to move to your Dropboxes, your Office 365s and whatnot. Larger organizations, they move slower, and they have to, right? They've got more constraints on them. They've got more data governance and whatnot. And so they need to be a little bit more focused. They know that these new tools like Dropbox and whatnot out there are being vetted by the smaller companies. And then, companies like Cloudian and Storage Made Easy are coming in, telling them they can have the same features, but on premise to help vet the concerns that they're going to have, either around security or around, loss of control.
Yeah, and I think that we see a lot of times, John, you and I have been in this industry for a while, and it seems like every so often there's like, oh, this is the next new big thing. I remember when like laptop backup first came out, and everybody had to have laptop backup, and like only 20% of the companies, I think, ever really implemented it. And I think we saw that with enterprise file sync and share. But I think we've seen sort of, not a great adoption of it, given it makes sense. And I think we see a bunch of challenges here, right? The first is finding the right storage platform is really a challenge for an enterprise file sync and share. John, NAS is kind of like massive overkill for an enterprise file sync and share situation, isn't it?
Well, exactly right, George. I mean, we would say that NAS is a different solution for a different problem. Matter of fact, we do offer a NAS solution ourselves. It's a product called Hyperfile. That's a NAS, enterprise NAS system. But we would propose that this is a different kind of problem. Right. This is collaboration. Yeah. This is providing all the tools for sharing data out over a wide range of users and letting them share that information out via links, which introduces a whole different set of challenges. So, NAS is great for file storage. We use it for connecting to applications that use files. But for this environment, yes, we definitely think it's a different problem that requires a different kind of solution.
Yeah, in some ways it goes back to the evolution of collaboration you had in the last slide. NAS is where everybody started, and there are certainly still people there today, but if they're there today, they're kind of missing the boat on some of these, forward-thinking technologies. They're probably stuck on NAS, they're stuck on email-based collaboration.
Yeah, as long as we got the word evolution in the title here, George, I mean, I think everything evolves as requirements change and also expectations change. I mean, one thing we talk about a lot here is, the consumerization of IT. Everyone expects things to be as easy to use as their iPhone or as, easily adopted as Google. And the challenge is that, if you're not living up to that expectation, your customers aren't necessarily going to adopt your solution. And that's what we've seen is that, again, customers will go towards the thing that is easiest to implement. And the cloud file sharing has certainly gotten there. That takes the eyeballs away from the traditional enterprise solution and means we have to evolve. And so evolution is really the key to this whole thing, is evolving into a solution that gives us the control while giving us the ease of use at the same time.
Yeah, and I also think that there's, we don't have a bullet to it, but Doug, curious to get your thoughts on that. I think there's also a bit of kind of like an awareness of understanding what's at risk here. Right? You know, I think that one of the challenges we have as IT people is we're so busy running around trying to get really, really big, important projects off the ground that, you know, letting the users run their own Dropbox or you know, not really staying after this seems like the easy way out. And a lot of times this can really come back to haunt you, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the easy way out. So, you know, users are going to, if you give them too much friction, they're going to do what we used to call shadow IT. They're going to go find their own services. They're going to find a way to work around that friction. You know, but the problem is that now you've got data scattered, an employee leaves the company, they were the one administering your Dropbox solution, or they had corporate data out there. So what you really want is to have it as simple as possible, but under IT's governance. But that said, you know, back to this slide right here, you know, file sync and share definitely stalled in the beginning because maybe it was web only. So if you look at Dropbox, they were, you know, web only for a time, and then they had a sync tool, and users were used to having, you know, a map drive from their NAS. And at the end of the day, just like John said, users are going to do what's simplest, easiest for them. Some of them, that's going to be web. Some of them want it as a map drive. And a lot of the enterprise file sync and share solutions just didn't cover all the bases. And I think that that's something that in the past stalled some of the adoption.
Yeah, totally agree with that. So let's, you know, I kind of did this backwards on purpose, but let's talk about some of the advantages, right? And so, because I think it's still a worthy cause to get the file collaboration process done on premise, especially for the larger environments. You know, number one, you have greater control over what is shared and with whom. You know, Doug, I know that you guys have a big presence in the UK, and so you're probably closer to this than we are, but even in our world, we're starting to see, okay, well, if you send us a spreadsheet, we can't do it via email anymore. It's got to be password protected, and we want to put it on this shared drive or something like that, right? So it's people are starting to really wake up to, hey, I got to control where this data is going and how it's being, you know, what the chain of custody is. Are you seeing people start to kind of pay attention to that?
We are, especially with GDPR. So GDPR in Europe has, you know, key covenants around how you control and distribute your data. And it's something that you don't think about on a daily basis. You know, data comes into your company, it's got some personal information in it, whether that's the user's address and whatnot. You put it into your database, maybe you write it up on a Word doc and you put that Word doc on Dropbox. But at that point, you've just transferred some control over to a different company. You've exported some of that data. And so the bigger companies that are concerned about GDPR, or even now American companies, because we've got, say in California, our own version that's just passed of GDPR, they're looking at how do I start putting a framework in today that is going to allow me to control all of my data and know where it is, because whenever I give it to an external source, I now have more complications.
Yeah, exactly. And then, John, from a physical perspective, we also have the challenge that you know, most of these solutions require that you copy it somewhere, right? And so you don't have the advantage of an on-prem solution is you can have a single point of storage for this data. And then also, you know, you talked a little bit about how you guys can bring the cloud on-prem in your opening. You have the advantage of owning storage versus renting it. And renting it looks good up front, but at some point, owning becomes a much more cost-effective way to have your storage, right?
Absolutely. So you made 2 points in there, George. So definitely owning it makes a lot of sense. If you're running a data center anyway, which most of our customers obviously are, the cost of maintaining that data on-prem is actually far lower because, you know, we're selling solutions at under a cent per gigabyte per month. So, you know, your cost of ownership is going to be lower, first of all. Second of all, by having it on-prem, as you already pointed out, you have control. You know where that data is. And one of the key tenets of privacy is the right to be forgotten. And the right to be forgotten means that all of your data for a particular user has to be findable and has to be deletable on request. And if you don't know where all that data is, and you can't be absolutely positively sure you know where it all is, that's a real risk. And if it's out in the cloud or if it's being shared indiscriminately among users, you do lose that visibility, and that is a huge risk for GDPR and for the new regulations that are being adopted here in California as well.
And John, correct me if I'm wrong, but a couple of years ago, I saw, just in the news nonstop, Google cut their price, Amazon cut their price, everybody's cutting their price, it was a race to zero. And it really feels like that just hasn't made the news in the last few years. They've kind of leveled out. Is that what you're seeing as well?
Yeah, they're definitely leveling out. I mean, they're making significant money on these services, which is terrific. We love to see people making money in storage. But on the other hand, if you've got a solution that can reside in your data center, which obviously there's a lot of reasons why this should reside in your data center, this makes perfect sense. Cloud is great for some things, on-prem is great for others, and that's what we've seen. Again, it's an evolution. The race to the cloud has now been tempered by the reality that some things are better put in your data center, and this is one classic example.
I think the other thing we see sometimes is the old concept of data gravity. If all of your data is already on-premise, moving a significant portion of it to the cloud or to a different site just doesn't give users the performance that they're used to having. And at the end of the day, users want, a simple experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, particularly in environments where people are sharing large files, we do a lot of work here in marketing with moving around image files or video files, which, in many cases are significant in size. And when you're dependent upon a WAN link, that can definitely impact your performance versus using an internal network. So yes, absolutely, that makes a difference as well. As data gravity tends to keep data where it was created, and that's the most efficient place to keep it.
Yeah, I think one of the important things that I always point out to people when we get into a cloud discussion is the cloud is really good at the temporary. It's not so good at the long term, right? And when you talk about data, and data gravity is a really good point, Doug, it is you can't, where you can fire up 10,000 processors, use them for 5 minutes and you're done. You can't, fire up 5 petabytes of data, use it for 5 minutes, and then delete it, right? Most of the time, you had that 5 petabytes, took you forever to get it there, and the last thing you're going to do is delete it as soon as it gets there, right? So it's using, I think what we're seeing now, and I think this is the John point, is using the cloud in the right way at the right time is really the key. So let's move on a little bit and talk about, some of the things we can do to fix it. And Doug, I really want to come to you on this because I frankly stole the term from you guys because I liked it. But this concept, give me the difference in your mind of a file fabric. What's different about that than file sync and share?
So file sync and share is kind of the commoditized term today. You can buy a Drobo, you can buy anything, and it's got kind of file sync and share there, which just means that you can generate a link and have somebody access that software. What a file fabric does is distinctly different. It's not just the collaboration use piece of sending out links. It's the ability to audit your data. It's the ability to work with different types of storage on the back end and give that user a single pane of glass. Because at the end of the day, if the user is currently using a NAS-based solution and you're trying to move them onto something else, it's got to be a seamless single pane of glass. And there's going to be a period of time where they're moving, say, from their NAS onto their Cloudian software. And so they need to have that, just like Microsoft would do with what's called a DFS, where if you had a bunch of different filers, they would all appear as a single share. You need technology that does something like that. You also need to ensure that you're auditing these files. A lot of GDPR is around who touched the data and when they touched the data. So File Fabric is going to give you the ability to audit that data. And then protection. One of the things that we see a ton of is, everybody has today encryption in flight. In fact, Google just updated Chrome, I think yesterday. If you've got a web page that's HTTP, you're now marked as completely insecure. So the in-flight encryption's been handled, and a lot of people believe that the cloud's giving you a good ability to encrypt your data at rest. And what we've seen is you can encrypt your data at rest, and that means that if Amazon, Google, somebody throws away a hard drive, you don't have risk of losing that data. But improperly managing your ACLs, your file permissions and whatnot is going to leave you the possibility, we've seen this a ton in the news, of having a bucket that's exposed to the world And that encryption in flight and that encryption at rest are really doing nothing for you at that point. And that's something that we work a ton with Cloudian. One, it's on-premise with Cloudian, and two, they handle something called SSEC encryption that's going to ensure that it's almost like, think of it as 2FA for your storage. You need not just the access codes to get in there, but a separate encryption code to access any of your storage.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a big deal, right? Because one of the challenges I always see with the kind of the baseline encryption technology is most of the weakness has nothing to do with the hardware; it's the humans, right? And you know, I was talking to a guy this morning. He said, "Well, I solved my password problem. I only use 2 passwords for everything." I'm like, "Wow, that's awesome." I was like, so you've been reading my site a lot. Then I appreciate that. But anyways, you know, I mean, so that's a big deal. So I think that gives us a good overview of the software capabilities. John, let's talk a little bit about what we need to do to fix from a hardware standpoint. I think one of the big ones that jumps out to me here, and this is something that I've always liked about object storage, is it can do more than one thing, right? Instead of, with a file sync and share and collaboration, it's kind of hard to go out and buy a storage system that just does collaboration. You want to do kind of be multi-purpose so you can leverage that cost and that investment across a couple of different operations. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, and that's a classic point, George, because again, this ease of use, right? If you need something that's going to be easy for the IT guy to use as well as the user, and certainly the simplest solution is the one you've already got that's doing different jobs. And that is, as you point out, the classic benefit of object storage is because it is scalable and because it can handle both file and object data within a single system, you essentially never run out, right? You can use it with all different kinds of applications. You can use it with all different kinds of data sizes. It scales on demand, and it's essentially evergreen because, you know, the environment never has to be swapped out. There's never a forklift upgrade. You know, the nodes, as we call them, the individual pieces, the building blocks of the system can be swapped out individually over time without ever bringing the system down. So it's an evergreen environment that you can use for all kinds of different purposes, and that means it essentially becomes the easiest thing to use in your data center because you just plug other data sources into it and voila, they've got a home. So it's not like having to set up, as you say, a separate system that then has to be managed separately and then has to be upgraded separately, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's, you know, that is the way of the past. The way of the future is everything is cloud-like. You know, whether it's in your data center or whether it's actually in the cloud, it all manages with that same kind of lights-out operation, and that's exactly what, you know, object storage delivers.
And John, let me hit on another key focus that I think we've run into with some of our joint customers, and that's that when we're talking about GDPR, and you had commented before on the right to be forgotten, you know, users out there that are backing up their data and they're backing it up to tape, you know, the provisions in GDPR essentially say that if I'm a user and I say, you know, delete my accounts, you need to delete those, and you can only keep that data for, say, another 90 days or so. And, you know, it's really not realistic to go out there and pull tapes and pull out just my records and whatnot. You know, with object storage, it seems like today backup is I want to say backup to tape is totally a thing of the past. You've got the ability to replicate between multiple data centers. You've got lifecycle management where you can automatically have data deleted. I mean, what are you seeing or what are you promoting around this right to be forgotten and how object is superior?
So, hey, John, before you jump into that, let me advance because we've been hitting about GDPR, so let's pull it up. And just let me kind of hijack that question if I can, Doug, because we've been involved in a couple of data management designs, and one of the things I ended up with in all of those is it wasn't just tape; it was just backup in general. Because if you think about the way most backup systems today back up unstructured data, they back it up as a blob because there's, you know, we're dealing with millions and millions of files nowadays. It takes too long to lock the file system. Well, the moment you store data in a blob, and most of those systems, even though you're kind of backing up a blob or an image, you can pull out an individual file, but you got to know exactly what file you're looking for and where it is. In the case that you just gave as an example, if John Smith says, hey, remove me. You don't know where John Smith's stuff is within all those backups, right? And so in both of the designs we worked on, we actually set the retention period of backup for 7 days. And then everything else was archived discreetly as individual files into an object store. So John, that should be a good setup for you to take it away.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point, is that you can manage these things much more discreetly, and everything is randomly accessible. So as Doug says, you can get in and delete things when you need to. That one of the really beautiful advantages of object storage is the self-protecting nature of the system, either by erasure coding across nodes, which is essentially data striping, or by replication. You've got ways of protecting the data in ways that still retain that random accessibility. So you don't lose the ability to go in and delete data where you need to, as you will if you just put on a tape and ship it off to Iron Mountain. So you don't sacrifice that erasability, yet you still have complete durability, which is the whole point of storing system data in an environment like this.
I think one of the key things that Storage Made Easy is able to tie into when we're working with an object storage platform like Cloudian is the ability to version your data versus kind of what a filer would do, which is a snapshot. So, a snapshot is traditionally, it's 8 p.m., I'm going to take a snapshot, and I've frozen all the data at that point in time, and that's all the data. But when you work on something like a Dropbox, say, in Office 365, what users are now accustomed to is the concept of versioning, which means if I work on a file and I save it or I alter it 5 times, I have 5 versions of that file exactly when I altered the data. If I didn't work on it at 8 p.m., that doesn't really relate to me. And so now with the ability to version data to find just the data you need and delete it, you're not looking at a snapshot where you go, gee, I got to keep that snapshot for 6 months or some other reason, and it has data you can't keep along with data you can keep. Each object is its own independent, if you think of like snapshot, and you're able to just clean up the data or work with the data you need in kind of a much more modern approach.
So, Doug, let's also talk about one other thing that we talked about yesterday. That I'm always kind of trying to convince people, look, GDPR is not just a European Union thing, right? That obviously if you have presence in the European Union, almost of any sort, you're going to probably be impacted. But we are now increasingly seeing laws and regulations arising in other areas, and you guys both were talking about a new one going on in California. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, this is an issue where we've had hacks like the Equifax hack, and you're going to see, America and other countries around the world saying you need to protect our data better. I mean, we look at what happened with Facebook and the Cambridge Analytics. And so, users, some of these companies, we are the product. And if we are the product, we want to have more control over, where our data is and how it's being used. And so California was the first one to pass this GDPR-like law, much to the chagrin of Facebook and Google and a bunch of, companies that call, say, Silicon Valley home. And, if they can do it, I certainly think that this is going to be a sweeping effort. So, we are Storage Made Easy is a London-based company. We've done a ton of business around GDPR in the EU. We've also worked with multinationals that are here in the US. But I think the time is now to start taking control of your data.
Yeah, and I'll tell you another thing. My take on this is, this will sound like a weird analogy for the listeners, but bear with me. It's kind of like recycling, right? They didn't pass a law in Texas that thou shalt recycle, but they put enough recycle bins out, and like all my neighbors had recycling bins, so I was like, okay, I'll recycle. I think it's an awareness issue, and as a few more states and a few more countries pass these sort of tough privacy regulations, people will just start to demand it. And at some point, once you're managing data, it doesn't make sense to have a special data management policy for California and the EU. At that point, you might as well just manage everybody's data, right? It's almost actually more complex to have like a really bad management policy for everybody else and a really good management policy for the states that are passing it. So I think that eventually we'll just be, as companies, we'll just be compelled to, as a nature of being competitive, to be able to take care of customer data.
I completely agree with you. You know, I think if I'm an IT administrator today, I want to do two things. One is I want to get ahead of a future problem. And then the second thing is the state of object storage today, the state of, you know, say the Storage Made Easy file fabric are such that my users are going to have a superior experience. So why not start a project like this today? It's going to, you know, make my life easier in the long run. And when something comes along and my boss says, hey, how are we going to prepare for whatever the Texas GDPR, I can say, already done.
Yeah. There'll probably be something with, never mind. I was going to say something about guns, but never mind. So the...
Texas gun.
Yeah. So anyway, so let's sew all this together and wrap this thing up. You know, we talked a little bit about a file fabric, and it seems that, you know, as you kind of talk about GDPR, compliance, privacy, all those sort of things, that this really sets itself up well. And I think one of the things I want to make sure people get out of this is that this data that we're talking about, the user data, is probably the stuff that is right now the most vulnerable, if you will, because it's the stuff that's kind of shared the most without thinking about it. It probably has as much personal information as anything does. And so I think to jump on what you said, Doug, is jumping in on this is really important right now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the Europeans had 2 years to prepare for GDPR, and yet we can see that on May 25th, when it came into effect, I can't tell you how many, you know, websites and whatnot shut down their services to the EU because they weren't prepared. And, you know, that's just business loss because the EU is you know, obviously a major system of revenue for a lot of American-based companies.
Yeah, exactly. John, any comments? What's your thoughts, sir?
Well, I think, Georgia, yeah, GDPR, as you already pointed out, is a catalyst, right? It's a catalyst to do things which we already should be doing, and to some extent have been doing, but need to accelerate and need to do better. You know, it's like here in the U.S. we had seatbelts in our cars. They existed. Did people use them? Not much until we got seatbelt laws, and all of a sudden they became ubiquitous and readily used. So GDPR is that same kind of catalyst, but it's a catalyst for something we should be doing anyway. You said that you know, PII is readily shared, and that's a reality. It is readily shared. I mean, a NASA employee had 10,000 Social Security numbers on a stolen laptop. I mean, what were 10,000 Social Security numbers doing on the laptop of a NASA employee to begin with? You know, that's just a classic, you know, screw up. That shouldn't have been there to start with. And why was that information shared onto a widely disseminated setting like that? And that's something you hear over and over again. I mean, and in the cloud, when it sits out in the cloud, the rate at which data is being compromised from misconfigured clouds has grown astronomically. I think the stat was in 2017, it grew over 400% from the previous year, just based on the increased usage of the cloud. So, you know, this is something that needs to be addressed regardless, and GDPR is a great catalyst, but IT has just got to get better at this across the board. Yeah,
like John just said, you know, what's good for GDPR is also good for, say, HIPAA or PCI DSS. You know, we're talking compliance here, and GDPR is just the newest, kind of tightest standard around that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that we can no longer afford to be very cavalier about our data, and I think, like I said, this data set, you know, John's example of the Social Security numbers is a really good example. I mean, it is treated very, very cavalierly, if that's a word, by the users, right? And so stuff that gets out through just common shares is amazing. And, you know, Doug, you mentioned the exposed Amazon buckets. I mean, you know, you've got to just be very, very careful with this stuff.
Yeah, so one of those makes the news every week.
Oh, yeah. Well, John and I did a webinar a while back on ransomware, and I was like, oh, I should, you know, let me go Google and see if there's been any recent ransomware attacks. Well, that was like the easiest search ever, right? You know, so these things are just happening all the time. So just to quickly summarize, you know, I think it's really important to move from a file sync and share mindset to a collaboration mindset. I think this move to a fabric is really important, and then I also think, you know, looking at object storage and its ability to be multi-purpose, is really a great way to get there. That way you can leverage the investment in storage across multiple purposes and things like that. Guys, I was really glad to get both of you guys on the webinar to talk about this. And John, I wanted you to go first on when we started talking about specific products, because I think a lot of times people forget how important the hardware is to the solution. So why don't you talk a little bit about what you're doing here?
Right. So we're going to sort of look at this from the ground up, which is, start with that basic foundation. Where is that data going? And what's really interesting about this is we're trying to get people to shift their minds from thinking of a cloud-based solution all the time for this collaboration to an on-prem solution. But to do that, you're really going to need something that's cloud-like in the way it scales, and the way it's managed, and the way the data is protected. And that's exactly what Cloudian is. So we are on-premise enterprise storage that scales in a modular way. So like the cloud where it's capacity on demand, this is also capacity on demand. You just add more nodes and the system grows. And it can grow to a matter of hundreds of petabytes, but you don't have to start with a big system to do that. Part of the beauty is, with Sync and Share, you may be starting with a relatively small number of users or a small number of use cases for other data, and you can start with a small system to do that, which is going to be very economical, but then grow it organically as your needs change. So that's really what Cloudian is all about. We're built off of the S3 API, which is the language of the cloud. It was the API created by Amazon for the S3 service. We use that exact same API on our platform as well, which ties seamlessly into SME's software. And we also provide a file connector. So for applications that require that file interface for applications, or for small number of users that want to share files, that's available as well. But for the SME solution, it's very simple. It plugs into our native S3 API, and you're good to go.
And at Storage Made Easy, we make a product called the File Fabric. It connects to over 60 different types of storage. And what we have been seeing a ton of today is the movement of that data from filers onto something like Cloudian. And so we can connect to multiple different types of storage simultaneously, give your users that Dropbox experience if they want to access it through the web. If they want to use kind of legacy methods like having a map drive in Windows, we handle that. We want to remove all the friction to getting your users to using a on-prem collaborative solution. We can install on-prem as a virtual machine or as an appliance. We can also install in the cloud because, for example, the Cloudian solution using that S3 API, that S3 API is the standard for moving data across different platforms across the internet in a compliant and standard way. And so, today what we're looking at are a couple of, business problems that I think we can address. And these business problems relate to the way that users are collaborating and sharing data. As we talked about before, there are a ton of people still just using their NAS as their collaborative platform. They're using their NAS plus email, and they're not getting work done effectively. They're also not securing the data in the way that they need to regulate against data leakage and whatnot. And they have no auditing, no capabilities of finding out whether or not they are in compliance, or who did, or how that NASA employee put all those names on that USB drive and social security numbers. And so, our combined solution is going to, from day one, give IT administrators that safety net, the encryption, the data protection, and the auditing capabilities. So, it's a Dropbox-like service, or 365 or Google Cloud, whatever, you prefer to compare it to. It's got universal access, meaning that, with the Storage Made Easy platform on top of Cloudian, you're going to be able to access that storage natively from Windows, Mac, Linux, a Chromebook via the web. We have iOS and Android. You name it, we give you the access to do it. You're not dealing with complicated VPNs or VPN software anymore. Everything is encrypted in flight, and then of course through Cloudian, we're handling encryption at rest. And as we talked about before, you've got some more advanced features here, like the ability to version your file versus taking a snapshot, which is what you think of traditionally with a NAS. You have the ability to, tie into all of your existing AD and other services.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll add on this is that with the Hyperstore, data protection is built in. So, clearly this is an enterprise solution. Data protection has to be part of it. That Cloudian system can replicate to a second Cloudian system using embedded software. So this is not a separate thing you have to manage. Using the features that are built into Cloudian, you can replicate that to a Cloudian cluster at another site to provide data protection that can still be randomly accessed. So you can go in and delete people and respect their right to be forgotten just as easily as you would delete it at a single site. So data protection plus manageability at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's key to be able to access your data in a timely manner, and that's what we're seeing everybody want today. The days of requesting a tape, waiting a day for the tape to come back and access your data are over. Today, people want a online solution, and that online solution needs to be economical, and that's exactly what Cloudian's providing on the back end. The combined solution is completely GDPR ready. And so what I mean by that is, the first thing is we're going to authenticate your users. We're going to tie into LDAP, Active Directory, or SAML to support authentication. We do things like 2FA. If you need tighter standards for authenticating, that can be biometric. That can be the universal, I forget what that's called, single sign-on, or it can be as simple as sending like a text to a cell phone. We're going to govern that data. So, today administrators are used to using something like a filer, and they have NTFS permissions that they're going to put on that filer. Obviously, when you move to Cloudian, you have a different system. You have IAMs and whatnot. And so we're going to give you a single pane of glass control into all of that data, governing it, who can share data, where they're going to share it with. Of course, as they're sharing and working with that data, a complete audit trail, and this may be a complete audit trail for all of your different data sources. So, gone are the days of, worrying, well, I just bought this new solution, they don't tie into some sort of auditing software. We will audit all of the data, and in auditing that data, we can export it to a Splunk, an Elk Stack, a syslog server, or you can just do the auditing right in the file fabric. Of course, everything is encrypted. Encryption is a key part of HIPAA and GDPR and PCI DSS. This is going to be both in flight and it's going to be at rest. We keep up to date with all the modern ciphers. We make sure that we're using the most modern TLS standards. PCI DSS just expired the TLS 1.0 in June from being something that is handleable. And then at the end of the day, the most important part, I think, and John's commented on this already, is the ability to discover the data you have. So if I, Doug Soltesz, say, listen, I want to be forgotten, I don't want you having my PII data, you have a certain amount of time to remove that. Finding where my data is can be very hard, but not with our combined solution. We have the ability to search within documents, that metadata. We can find what documents have my information and quickly alert administrators or the GDPR reviewer to those documents so that corrections can be made.
And also know where those documents are. So if they're getting shared where they shouldn't be, you can know. If you're sitting on somebody's laptop and you don't want Social Security numbers on people's laptops,
absolutely.
You can now find that out.
when a piece of data comes into the Cloudian system, whether it comes in direct or through SME, we pick it up, we index it. If we find a Social Security number, there are over 60 different types of data that can be flagged, as well as a user can put in their own flags for certain types of data. So maybe you have your own internal registration number or something that needs to be flagged. Those are flagged, those are auto-classified, and again, the appropriate people can be alerted if a salesperson, for example, puts into the sales folder a spreadsheet that has a number of credit cards in it.
So for Doug and John, I'm George Crump, lead analyst for Storage Switzerland. Thank you for joining us today.